There's a really unique overlap between spirituality and magic and activism and justice work. And these two things are often not connected, but we have to be talking about it. But the main idea that I think connects these things is from an Indigenous scholar named Tyson Yunkaporta. And the idea is this: there's a difference between our way of thinking and the product of that thought. Let's get into it. This idea I first came across through Rune Soup, a creator here on YouTube, but also you can find him in other places. And he hosts the largest online community of magic learners and practitioners. And his content has been so informative to my spiritual practice, and I highly recommend his work. So I'll have him tagged in the description box down below. Please go check out his work. But like I mentioned, this is an idea originally from Tyson Yunkaporta. And the difficulty with this idea that there's a difference between a way of thinking and a product of thought is that we often conflate the two. I do it all the time. We see other people do it all the time. And I think it's really dangerous, actually, to a lot of our work, to living coherently, because I believe that the way we think and our product of thought need to line up, but should be thought of as distinct. The way of thinking is your worldview, your thought process, your approach to philosophizing things about the world, about your experience, about being a human being. When you have a question, how do you go about asking it? When you sit down and journal, what is the framework, the paradigm, the place that your feet hit the ground? Where are you working from when you think about things, when you ask questions, when you stay curious? That's your way of thinking. And large communities all practice ways of thinking in our individual scale, right? We have an individual way of thinking, but also a broad social societal way of thinking. And we can see this so evident in the way that different cultures across the world are extremely different in how they approach things. And then there's the product of thought, the conclusion. After you've asked your questions, after you've done your research, after you've done your reflection, what product comes of that? What is the item, the tangible piece of that process that you are now going to put into practice? When we only focus on the products of our thoughts and other people's thoughts, we really jeopardize ethics, for one, but also meaning. The actual meaning piece of this process that is generative and expansive, because meaning isn't a closed door. It's not a checked box. And the way you reach meaning is about making it. It's about creating it. It's an action, right? We've been told meaning is a noun. It's a thing, but that's just not true. In my 8 years of researching the human experience and making meaning, that's not how humans do it. It's an evolutionary process. And when we don't keep an eye towards this progress, towards evolution, towards expansion with this progress, we lose the grit, the teeth behind these ideas. In his book, Sand Talk, Yunkaporta really emphasizes how Indigenous communities focus on this how, this why, this approach, this attunement to work, not the what, right? Not the conclusion of something, but the approach, the comportment through this question asking, curious process, and describes how that is kind of the important stuff. It's the juice of the fruit. He writes, "Abstraction is the enemy of Indigenous thought. We don't extract knowledge, we create meaning through relationships and narratives." This is story-based, it's communicative, it's in relationship to something else. It's not singular, it's not exclusive, and it's not constrictive. It should feel open and connective. this meaning is the connective tissue between us and our communities. It's love. Like, that's the thing that's coming to me as I'm saying this. Like, that thing that connects us all when we make meaning from this place of the way we want to attune to things. We want to have as Heidegger would call it, a poetic attunement to this work. And that poetic attunement allows us to put on love goggles as opposed to judgment goggles. When Rune Soup talks about this idea, he talks about the difference between procedural and declarative thought. And I think you can see how that maps onto this product of thought versus way of thinking really nicely, right? Declarative thought is the product of thought. This is a declaration, this is a truth, this is the product, this is a sentence or a word that I can easily understand that is done. Here is the thought. Whereas procedural thought is actionable, moving knowledge that you have to work with and through. It's about a process of coming to understand things, but it's also the difference between proving a hypothesis that would be declarative or the scientific process, which is procedural. It's about the way that we can use knowledge systems to explore knowledge itself, our relationship to knowledge and insights, and our relationship to the self and the world around us. To take us back to the beginning with what I was talking about in the intersection between spiritual, metaphysical, magical thought and activism and justice work, I want to use the example of burning sage to illustrate what I'm talking about. Most of us have heard that you can burn sage, a practice that is called smudging, to clear negative energy in your space. But that's the product of thought, not the way of thinking that led to this knowledge. And actually, a lot of people practice burning sage only knowing the product of thought, not the way of thinking. And that poses some real ethical but also philosophical problems. Ethically, white sage burning has been used across Indigenous communities in this practice called smudging, largely in closed ceremonies. And closed ceremonies and spiritual practices means that only people invited into this spiritual tradition should be practicing this magic or this practice in this way. And by the product of thought being something that's been proliferated, the way of thinking about burning sage has been completely lost. And even though you're not necessarily invited into the closed practice, it's appropriative. And there's layers here, right? Because just because you're practicing something that's used in a closed practice doesn't mean you fully understand the extent of this closed practice. But you are practicing something that you should be invited into when you haven't been, unless you have been. Maybe you have been, I don't know, but I haven't been. And for that reason, when I learned this, decided to stop using sage in my spiritual practices out of respect for the closed nature that the way of thinking led to this product of thought. Right? Smudging specifically is a term used for these spiritual practices, so there's a difference between burning sage and smudging, and there's also a difference between practicing something spiritually out of deep respect, connection, and invitation, and imitation uninformed. But just because I don't choose to practice the product of thought of burning sage anymore doesn't mean that I've abandoned the way of thinking that is behind the conclusion of burning sage. Now that I understand more about the way of thinking, even though certainly I am not privy to these closed Indigenous practices, there are ways that I have chosen to change what I burn, what I use to cleanse and purify my sacred space, with the same intention that I was using with sage previously, but now doing so in a way that actually aligns more with my ethics and philosophical beliefs, as opposed to just imitating an ancient practice that I didn't understand. But to dive into the way of thinking even more, from a scientific lens, sage does have very practical properties. It smells great. which aromatherapy we know lowers stress and makes you feel good. We all like burning candles. It's also antimicrobial and releases negative ions, which is why people have Himalayan salt lamps and other things that literally clear your air, right? But spiritually, the way of thinking behind sage was that it was a deeply magical plant offered to us as a gift from Mother Gaia that allows us to connect to spirit realm, to something bigger than ourselves, to the earth, to grounding energy, but also to our ancestors. So if we can think of the intention, the way of thinking behind burning sage being to clear your space, to shake out the spiritual cobwebs, the energetic cobwebs, to sanctify your space and connect you to spirit, well, what are other things that make me think of clearing things out, being connected, dusting out the cobwebs to generate this calm, peaceful, clean air? Both air in the literal matter sense, but also in the energetic sense. So, eucalyptus is known for its medicinal properties. It's what's used in like Vicks VapoRub, the mentholy kind of thing that can clear your sinus passages. And eucalyptus teas, eucalyptus essential oils are all used for purifying things. It's also antimicrobial. So I've started integrating eucalyptus into my practice as a way to cleanse and purify. Obviously, it burns slightly differently than sage and it smells differently, so the product of thought is different. But the way of thinking with my intention behind this is I do want to use something in my metaphysical magical practices that clear my space, that I can tie an intention to because that feels important to me in my work, but I don't want to simply imitate and mimic in a honestly inappropriate way that I was doing with sage in the past. So I want to approach this from a mindful place, and I reached a different conclusion even though I wanted to keep the same way of thinking that I had, even though that there were pieces of it that was flawed. Does that make sense? So in this example, my product of thought was tied to one way of thinking, but because I didn't fully understand that way of thinking, the product of thought was unethical. But when I fully understood all of the way of thinking around it, I can disconnect the way of thinking that does work for my ethical beliefs and for my spiritual practices to reach a new product of thought that works for my ethics, my philosophy, my spirituality, and sheds the inappropriate piece of burning sage, of that product of thought. So eucalyptus isn't intended to mimic sage. It's supposed to mirror the similar intention that I had behind it. This is framed through my own understanding of culture and my spiritual worldview in ethics and more research than I did when I first started burning sage. But this is the difference between simply replicating a product of thought and fully understanding a way of thinking and why it's dangerous to conflate the two. But this idea shows up everywhere, not just in magic and spiritual practices. That's just one example. The other example I want to use is Black Lives Matter. It's a powerful slogan and a product of a much deeper way of thinking about life, justice, equality, inequality, racism, anti-racism, and the value of Black lives. If you just repeat a slogan without understanding the way of thinking behind it, your activism is toothless. It's not juicy. There's no pulp behind that juice, right? But when we understand and embrace the ethic, this thinking about liberation and systemic inequality, that Black people deserve safety and purpose and the ability to pursue life, then the slogan carries that power of your way of thinking. Your use of the product of thought can honor the depth of the way of thinking that exists behind it. And these products of thought are helpful. It's what we can chant at protests. It's what we can write on picket signs. It's the thing that can unify a movement. But that's not a replacement for the way of thinking, nor is it the way of thinking in and of itself. Oftentimes these movements are boiled down and criticized to just being one slogan when that's not the case at all. So it's also important when we're being critical of movements in progress that we interrogate other people's views, not just as products, but as ways of thinking. And that's why there's so much harm behind this conflation. Again, we see this happen all the time with headlines, clickbait, viral content. The product of thought boiled down into a thumbnail is not the same as the way of thinking that is illustrated throughout the video. But when we are simply adopting conclusions and not thinking or questioning or understanding, what are we doing? What are we doing? Again, I want to emphasize that these products of thought are helpful. They are useful. Product of thought in and of itself isn't bad. It's when the product of thought is mistaken as the way of thinking that we get into trouble, both in how other people receive us and how we receive other people. Recently, I posted a TikTok that a lot of people did not like, and people from all sorts of different backgrounds. I was talking about something kind of like this, that was the intersection between spiritual thought and justice work, and I had people in my comments saying that I was just parroting back Christian points of view and that all Christians think the same, and one, I'm not even Christian. But then also I had people in my comments angry at me for being too radical and for being a witch. And, well, I do kind of identify with a witch and with being a radical. It's like, well, hang on. You thought the exact opposite of what these other people did. And I realized they heard the first few sentences that I said at the beginning of this TikTok as the product of thought and went to the comments section before engaging with my way of thinking that I went into throughout the rest of the video. And granted, it was a pretty long TikTok, but the comments were angry from all sorts of sides, and not just in the spiritual sense, also in a political and activist sense. And while I do consider myself firmly in the progressive field, there were progressives upset with what I said, but also conservatives upset with what I said. And it was an interesting thing for me to realize, because on one hand, I'm really glad that I'm sparking conversation in that my viewpoint isn't necessarily the thing that I'm communicating. I'm trying to communicate a way of thinking about these things, not just my personal conclusion. However, I also want my personal conclusions about these things to be clear as well, because I think that that's part of ethics too. I want to talk about both of these things, but I'm not trying to convince anyone of a product of thought. I just want to own my product of thought. But I certainly do want to convince you of why it's important for you to consider the way of thinking. But then I was having feelings and reactions to all of these comments that I was getting and all of these different thoughts, and I realized I'm doing the exact same thing to them that they just did to me. I am reading the sentence that they put in the comments that is a product of their thought, and I have no idea what the way of thinking is that got them there, and so it's impossible for me to actually engage with their way of thinking. And I was feeling my feels in judging people in the comments, literally judging people in the comments based on their product of thought and not the way of thinking. And granted, there are certain products of thought that are deeply harmful, and we need to be critical of those. But if we want to engage in dialogue about progress, just like Tyson Yunkaporta said, that's the way of thinking. It's rooted in connection and narrative, dialogue, discussion. That's how we move forward. And that's the work that I'm interested in doing, not debating what slogan is best. but debating how we can best make the world a better place. And it sounds trite, but it's true. I was purely judging these people based on the conclusion that they reached and the reaction that they said based on that conclusion, not how they might have gotten there and how that could inform the way I create content in the future to be more informative, more helpful, more indicative of what I'm actually trying to talk about. So, in conclusion, products of thought are helpful. They're important. We use them every day. We need to engage in shorthand in order to get throughout our day, because you can't stop and explain your entire way of thinking, your entire worldview, your entire paradigm to everyone that has a question about one belief that you have. But those must be rooted in the way of thinking. And if we want to step into a place of engaging with these difficult topics, when we are in the zone of engaging with it, we must be dealing with the way of thinking. That is where ethics lies. The way of thinking is meaning making in and of itself. And that is true of magic, spirituality, politics, activism, work, how we engage in online spaces, just about everything. You can hear one sentence someone says and assume a whole life behind it and be deeply, deeply wrong or deeply right. But either way, that's really not fair. Exploring the way of thinking is nuance, is complexity, is giving time and space to these difficult conversations that actually lead to progress, that actually leads to our ability to change and grow, not just personally, but in communities too, right? Again, there are certain products of thought that are harmful, but when we have the time and space to engage in the way of thinking, I think we should. That's how you actually change minds and hearts and yourself. I found Tyson Yunkaporta's work really, really powerful, and I'm really grateful to Rune Soup for drawing this connection between magic and activism in this way for me and introducing me to Yunkaporta's work. So please go check out both of them. They're both amazing and fabulous and have been really powerful for me in my research recently. And I'd love to know what you think. Did this spark something for you? Did this change the way you think about something? Did it add language or insight to something else that you had already been thinking of, maybe? I think for me, this really offered up a framework for talking about something that I had already been feeling, which is helpful when we want to talk about complicated things, but we don't know how to talk about them. Saying product of thought versus way of thinking is like, oh, that's a product of thought that I can use to talk about the way of thinking that goes behind Tyson Yunkaporta's way of thinking. Meta. But I hope that this sparked something, and if it did, give it a like. Feel free to subscribe. Check out other stuff that we have going on the channel. I love talking about this, and let's keep talking about it in the comments. Yes, we're going to be dealing with some products of thought, but I'd love to talk about your way of thinking if you're open to typing it all out. Thank you for being here, for being my favorite part of the Cohere Collective, for being a part of my making meaning journey and such a big part of my coherence. And as always, I hope you feel like you are living more coherently. Until next time, love.